We're going to get started in just a moment. Until we get started, I want to make a plug for a book I just started to read. It's by Noah Tishby. A friend of mine just gave it to me. You're shaking your head, Rabbi Weil. Noah Tishby, is it? Yes? Okay. I'm about a third of the way through it. She just gave it to me. And she is an Israeli actress who moved to America. And she wrote, it's called A Simple Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth. And she writes the history, basically what I've read so far is the history of the Jewish people in a very oversimplified and funny kind of way. And Bill Maher says this is not your Bubby's history book, and I have to agree with him. So just a plug for Noah Tishby, Israel, A Simple Guide to the Most Misunderstood Country on Earth. Apparently just came out. Okay, I know that other people will be joining us, but I want to be respectful of people's time. So welcome to our JCRC Fed Talk with a very esteemed guest presenter today. David Margulies will introduce him in just a moment. David introduced me to Rabbi Weil during the pandemic and invited me to attend some of his classes virtually that he gives from New York. And your teaching style is just terrific. I just really, really enjoy it. And I look forward to studying with you more in the future. As far as this Fed Talk is concerned, please, the format will be as our usual format on our Lunch and Learn. Rabbi Weil will present for a few minutes, however long he is prepared, and then we will take questions and answers until about 1 o'clock. So please put your questions in the chat, and I will try to get to as many of them as I possibly can. So without further ado, I want to turn it over to David to introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Rabbi Weil. Good to see you. I've had the privilege to know Rabbi Weil now for about 10 years. And I've heard him speak hundreds of times, and I've spent a lot of time with him, including a wonderful trip to Cuba for several days a few years ago, which was really eye-opening in a lot of ways. But I have a very good friend, Ari Sasher, who I think is just a phenomenal public speaker, who said to me about 2 years ago that he thinks the two best speakers, Jewish speakers around today are Rabbi Jonathan Sachs and Rabbi Stephen Weil. And I think that there's a lot of merit in that description. Rabbi Weil grew up on a cattle farm outside of Buffalo, New York. He is cursed with being a Buffalo Bills fan. You know, the debates every day whether Mashiach will come before the Bills win the Super Bowl. He is a graduate of Yeshiva University. He has an MBA from NYU's Stern School of Business. He is an authority on the works of Rav Soloveitchik, who is really the heart of the modern Orthodox movement and one of the great rabbis of the second half of the 20th century. He was a pulpit rabbi for many years in Michigan and in Beverly Hills, California, and then became the senior managing director of the Orthodox Union, where he was involved largely in community engagement efforts and some really phenomenal programs there. I came to know him as a speaker at the APAC conference, where he speaks every year, and built the pre-conference Shabbaton. From when I started going, it was about 18 people, and it's now about 2,000 or even more, largely because of Rabbi Weil's teaching, which brought a lot of people in, and it's just expanded tremendously. Rabbi Weil left OU recently to become the chief executive officer of the American Friends of the IDF. Even before that, he was passionate on primarily on two topics. One is on Jewish life and Jewish teachings, and the other is Zionism and the support, our support as Americans for the state of Israel. And even then, was a tremendous advocate for the Israeli Defense Forces as a not only leveling social its social functions within the state of Israel, but also as a shining example of a fighting force that is guided primarily by issues of morality in a very, very serious way, despite all the garbage we hear every day. So with no further ado, let me turn it over to Rabbi Weil.
David, thank you very much. And also a warm congratulations and mazel tov to David and Michelle upon the expansion of their family. And I want to thank David, and I want to thank Rabbi Ellen Bernhardt for really this invitation. I've had the honor to meet Rabbi Bernhardt over that last year, really since COVID. And her thoughts were that maybe give a little bit of an insight into the culture, the mentality, the psyche of the Israeli Defense Forces, of the IDF. It's that institution that really defines Israel more than any other institution. And my goal today maybe is to share some thoughts that you may not read in a newspaper, that we may not see on a newscast. Okay. The first is one that just deals with the whole morality and the ethics of the IDF. And to give you a statistic that frames everything, they've done studies on what's called asymmetric warfare. Asymmetric warfare means that the enemy combatant is not wearing a uniform. They're wearing civilian clothes. They're in a hospital, they're in a school, they're in a nursery, and they're shooting rockets or they're shooting at you. So in the history of the modern recorded history, if you keep Israel out of the equation, the most successful battle against asymmetric warfare in terms of from a morality point of view was the British conquest of Fallujah and Persian Gulf too. Fallujah, we as Jews know, is the famous Pumbedisa. It's the famous city on the Euphrates River, which really was the heart and soul of the Jewish world until the Islamic Revolution, where Baghdad became, further up the Euphrates, became the heart and soul of Babylonian society. But for about 400 years, Pumbedisa was so to speak, was the Jerusalem, was the Tel Aviv of the Jewish world. So when the British conquered that in Persian Gulf too, for every single combatant, 23 civilians were killed. We as Americans, if you look at our record in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, for every combatant, again, we're talking about people wearing civilian clothing, terrorists, for every that was killed, we killed 30. Okay, just to give you a context. And when you're dealing with the Russians against the Chechens, it's far worse than that, okay? What do you think Israel's record is? In 2012, in Gaza, and remember, these numbers are inflated because they're Hamas records, 2 civilians for every combatant. In 2014, the last war, the summer of 2014, Tzuk Eitan, what they called protective shield, 1-to-1 ratio. For every combatant killed, 1 civilian was killed. The 11 days of battle, when Hamas sent 4,400 rockets into Israel, the number is 0.6 for every combatant killed, 0.6 civilians for every combatant. And by the way, of those 0.6, we're close to half of them, if not more, but we can swear that close to half of them were actually killed by Hamas rockets. Because of the 4,400 rockets aimed at Israel, it ended up that about 400 of them actually landed in Gaza, many of them destroying homes, destroying lives, destroying children. And some of the carnage that you saw of dead children were actually from Hamas rockets, okay? Why am I saying that? The world doesn't always see that side of Israel, where Israel is off the bell curve when it comes to ethics and morality. The money and time and effort spent in creating precision-guided rockets, precision-guided missiles that will only hit the target, the money, time, and effort spent on quote-unquote knocking on the roof. These stories don't get published, and that's why many of the great terrorists are still alive, because there is no element of surprise, because Israel is not willing to take out civilian casualties. And it's not just, it is because of their love of Palestinian life. There's an incredible love and respect for Islamic life by Jews, by the Jewish army. But there's a second component, and that is that if a young man or a young woman, whether they're sitting behind a computer, whether they're flying the plane, whether they're on the ground overseeing an artillery missile, they want to make sure that when that young man or young woman comes out of the army, when they go on to become educated, to become married, to become a parent, they want to make sure that that person has the ability to function in a healthy psychological way, where they're not scarred by trauma, where they don't have on their conscience that they took out a Muslim child or that they killed a Muslim grandparent. They don't want that. That's just not what they want. And because of that, by the way, soldiers' lives are forfeited. Because of that, innocent civilian lives are forfeited. Jewish civilian lives, Israeli civilian lives. But that is what's called Tohar Neshek. That's the ethics, that's the ethical principles of how every commander is trained and how every commander trains their soldiers. You just won't see that in the news. But that statistic is one example of a statistic that there is no other army on earth like the Jewish army. I want to leave the military for a second. I want to talk about the IDF, but I want to leave the military for a second. What the IDF is national service. And what do I mean? We have a real problem in this country with cancel culture. When you have a situation where family members, this one's conservative and this one's progressive, where people who used to speak at the same country club or used to speak in the same neighborhood, they hate each other and despise each other, they undermine each other, they delegitimize each other because of the other's political persuasion or the other's political values and preferences. It's a sickness that is, it's a cancer that is metastasized throughout this country, where we no longer are a country. We hate each other. We despise each other. We don't respect each other. We can disagree with each other all day long, but there's a certain sense of, human civil discourse. There's a certain sense of respect. You know why that doesn't happen in Israel? Are they not afflicted by the same thing, where you can become a narcissist because you just focus on the website, or you focus on the news feed that speaks just to you and people who only think like you? Sure, they have problems with that. But what's the difference? It's the experience of the army. In one tent or one bunk, this one is Ethiopian. This one is a grandchild of Moroccan immigrants. This one is a South African immigrant. This one, their parents came from the Ukraine in the 90s. This one, their family's from Iraq. This one, they've been Israelis. They've been living in Jerusalem for six generations. Now, what's the common denominator of all of the above? Very little. They're very different religiously. They're very different politically. They're very different culturally. They eat different foods. But you know what? For 3 years, they learn to live with each other. They don't come out monolithic. They don't come out agreeing with each other on everything. They learn to live with each other. They learn to engage each other. They learn to respect and disagree with respect with each other, and they build a country together. It's the national service. Something else about this army. And that's why someone like myself is so enamored and so in awe of this institution. No Jew, no Muslim, no Christian, no Druze is left behind. First and foremost, all priorities go to minorities. I'll give you an example. There's not enough funds because, unfortunately, with the enemies they have on their northern border, their southern border, their western border, unfortunately, because of that, Israel spends 15% of the GDP on the military. Now, just to give you a context, the average first world country spends between 2 to 3% of the GDP. Germany is 2.2%. Hungary is 1.1%. Britain is 3.5%. Israel's spending 15%. It's one of the biggest miracles in Jewish history that economy survives with a 14.9%. This year was over 15% of the GDP spent on the military. So what do they do? I should say, what do we do, meaning the diaspora community that partners with them? We provide them, and this is the desire of the general staff, starting with Aviv Kochavi, the chief of staff, all the way down. Their goal is that this experience will give these young men and young women the ability to build the Jewish people, to build Israel and the Jewish world for the next 60, 70 years. Now, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Druze, or if you're a Christian, you take first priority to everything. They can only, I'm saying that the diaspora supporters at this point can only afford to fund free scholarships to university for underprivileged kids who go into combat units. Unless you're a Druze, Christian, or Muslim, it doesn't matter what unit you went to. You could have done anything in the Army. You're entitled to a free university education because they want you to have the tools, and they want to encourage Druze, Christians, and Muslims to participate in in what's called national service, the Israeli unification of cultures. But let's go back to the majority of soldiers who are Jews. This young woman, she was selling her body for sex from the time she was 12 years old so she could have drug money. This young man, he's been in juvenile prison 3 times. Forget that he doesn't have a 12th grade education. He doesn't have a 10th grade education. He doesn't have a 9th grade education. Now, in most societies, that young woman or that young man is a curse. They're a leech on society. And they're good. God knows how they'll end up, or God knows who will end up as the victim of their crime. Not in Israel. The army has special bases where the whole focus is to take people who are not just severely financially challenged, but people who are severely challenged in terms of their background, and give them a fresh start on life. Give them a fresh start on life. And that means first and foremost, and it's primarily female commanders, they're trained in self-respect and self-dignity. They're given the human skills that your grandchildren or my children learned at 8 years old. Certain things that an 8 or 9-year-old would take for granted, they don't have. And they're trained in basic human responsibility and skills. And 91% of them transition into a mainstream unit. And what happens on the tail end? The last 3 months, they get to spend having the chance to get a high school education. And if they need another 6 or 9 or 12 or 15 months, no problem. They're funded so that they can get a high school diploma. And if they're able to get into university, we'll pay for their university. Why am I using this as an example? No Jew, no Christian, no Muslim, no Druze is left behind. The goal of the national service that we call the IDF is to invest in human capital. It's to take kids, and many of you know this, that in Israel, it's a country of haves and have-nots, just like America is. If you go to a public school in a place like Montgomery County, Maryland, you're going to come out with a radically superior education than if you go to a public school in the South Bronx. It's just the nature of things. Well, it's no different in Israel. So what happens? The Ministry of Defense gets people like ourselves, American Jews, gets the famous Karen Rashi. Rashi was the famous medieval French Jewish leader, but Karen Rashi was named after him. You know where the money came from? Perrier. After they died, people realized that the people who owned Perrier were Jews who were huge supporters of the development of the Israeli people and Israeli society, particularly in the Negev, in the southern desert, the Negev. So what happens? You invest in these kids in the periphery with after-school classes and after-school computers and after-school training in artificial intelligence and computer programming and problem solving that enables them to have the same skills as everyone else. And what happens? When they make it into the army, instead of having some menial job, they actually play a role, and they refine their computer skills, they refine their technology skills, and they become engineers. They become computer programmers. They become part of the startup nation. So that the kind of biotechnology, the kind of communications technology, the kind of artificial intelligence technology that is transforming planet Earth, that's transforming the destiny of humanity, why is it coming out of Israel? Because it's not just the haves, but we, meaning the Jewish world, we invest in those who do not have, the have-nots, to give them a chance. Everyone used to joke, no one gave more pardons than President William Jefferson Clinton. I think, the only one who gave more pardons than President Clinton was President Rivlin, who just after 7 years, after his 7-year term, stepped down. You know who all of his pardons went to? Not to criminals. It went to juvenile criminals who came into the army, who had a second chance on life, who rehabilitated themselves, who were rehabilitated by caring, loving, nurturing commanders, and came out without any flaws, not because it came out stellar, but without any flaws or black marks. And he expunged their record because he wants them to have a chance on life, and they earned it. Lone soldiers, there's 6,800 lone soldiers in the IDF, and only 3,400 come from countries across the globe. From the 70 countries across the globe, we make up the largest. America has 1,200 lone soldiers in the IDF. But what about the 3,400 who don't come from across the globe, who are Israelis, who literally don't have a home to go to? She was abused sexually by a stepfather. This one was abused physically by a father. God knows the story. This one's from a Haredi home, who they don't want them coming home because it's going to be a bad influence on the other kids, the fact that this kid's in the army. Who knows what the reasons are? And for the 3,400 of them, there are probably 17 or 1,800 different reasons. But they look after them. They give them a chance. They provide housing. They give them the ability to build their lives. What I'm trying to say is, forgetting the very, very sophisticated military that it is, and when I'll put 2 words about that. The last 100 years of warfare, starting with World War II, starting in the 1930s, there was one principle. The principle is, whoever controls the skies controls the battle. Look at the miracle of 1967. Had it not been for the fact that Israel, in a surprise attack, the first hour and a half on June 5th, 1967, the first hour and a half of that war, had they not taken out the Soviet MiG jet, there were I think something like 1,500 of them Egypt had. If they had not taken out that Soviet MiG jet, Israel would have been destroyed. You would have had the second Auschwitz in a quarter of a century. It would have been Treblinka all over again. But once you took out the Soviet MiG jet, then the Egyptian tanks, the Egyptian infantry were target practice for the Israeli Air Force. And the opposite was the same principle, but the opposite result was true in 1973. When the Soviet Union provided the SAMs, the surface-to-air missiles, to Syria and to Egypt, and they took those Israeli jets out of the air like target practice, there almost wasn't an Israel. We almost lost the Jewish state after 25 years, because whoever controls the air controls the battle. That's not true anymore. Today, whoever controls cyber controls the battle. And you saw what happened in those 11 days in Gaza. How were they able to take out a whole infrastructure, an underground infrastructure of a terror army? How were they able to do that? The bombs that had those precision strikes, the missiles with precision strikes, it's all because there was an artificial intelligence. It wasn't as much human intelligence as it was cyber intelligence and artificial intelligence. And that saved Palestinian lives, not to mention that it saved Jewish lives. This is a country, starting with its military, that is training and is at the cutting edge of cyber intelligence, of artificial intelligence, and it enables them to save lives. What are they working on now? It's something out of a Star Wars movie. They're working on laser technology. Every time you use an Iron Dome missile, you're looking at a minimum of $50,000. So they're trying to develop laser technology. Who knows how long it'll take? Who knows the success of such a thing? But what happens is, in that army, in that national service, the sense of responsibility to people, the sense of responsibility to history, the sense of responsibility and commitment to values, as they say in Hebrew, arachim, to Jewish values, it manifests itself. So no matter where you come from, no matter what your family background, no matter what your educational background, you have an opportunity to grow as a young man or a young woman. They come in boys and girls, and they leave with an incredible sense of commitment, an incredible sense of tolerance, an incredible sense of responsibility, of diligence, and an incredible sense of what it means to be part of the Jewish people and to be a link in the chain of Jewish history. And they never take for granted that miracle, the only time in all of the only time in the annals of all of recorded history, that an ancestral homeland, people had refugees who were refugees for 2,000 years. So my family was in Germany for 350 years before Hitler. Who knows, where did we come from? Spain? Were we always in other parts of Germany? If we were, then we probably came through Italy, through Babylonia, back to Israel. I mean, we've been refugees for 2,000 years. That miracle is not over. That miracle is manifesting itself. It's playing itself out each day of modern history. And who is the one that's enabling it to happen? These young men and young women. As they grow together as a country, coming from literally me'arba kanfos haaretz, from the four corners of the earth, they've come together to grow together. And I'm not saying there aren't warps and pimples. I'm not saying it's easy. It's not easy to take, cultures from tens of countries in 5 different continents and merge them together in a precious tiny little land like that. Not a simple thing. But what does it? What's the vehicle? What is the pipeline that enables that miracle to evolve, to blossom, to flourish? The pipeline that enables that miracle to blossom, evolve, and flourish is what we call the IDF. It's much more than a military. It's Jewish values manifest in the building of a people, in the building of a nation. And it's something that we, the Jewish people, can be exceedingly proud of. And we can hold it up as a light into the nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Weil. To all of the attendees, if you have questions, please type them into the chat. I have a few that you sent me in advance. One of them you just touched upon, the arachim, the values. The question was, the IDF is usually the first to send help around the world, whether it's Haiti or wherever in the world. And most recently, we saw Surfside, Florida, and we just saw just a couple of days ago when the IDF left, and when they were singing Ani Ma'amun, how moving that was. The question was, is this based on Jewish values, humanitarianism, or PR?
Well, this is totally based on Jewish values. I will tell you this. The reason that this search and rescue, in fact, many of us actually are supporters of that, it's called Chilutz v'Hatzala. They're trained because of the different, how do I say this nicely? The kind of missiles, bombs, and weapons that Hezbollah has, that Hamas has. They know that if it's a very good likelihood that people will be trapped in a building. So first and foremost, it was developed to save lives in Israel. But because they have a very, very focused, developed mission, they have their own bases, their own training skills, they want to share that with the world. That's the Jewish way. That's chesed, that's tzedakah. Is, if we have an ability, we want to share it with the world. Now, the PR helps, but it's not being done for PR reasons. I have to tell you the backstory of Surfside. America actually did not ask them to send, they said, we don't need the whole group. They were ready to send literally soldiers. If you notice that the 15 that came, those were all reservists. They were there primarily for the following reason. Number one, because there was a large number of Jewish families that were affected by this. So they felt it would have on a psychological level a calming effect on the Jewish families. Number two, because the search and rescue division of the Army, that brigade, they have a computer model. They've developed a computer model that no one else has. And for something like this, it was the 9900 intelligence unit that brought that computer model. They could try to figure out, the assumption was most of the people were sleeping in their beds when this happened. So based upon a computer model of the structure of the building, where they could start to dig and where they could start to look, to try to find body. Now, they would publicly, but I can tell you, no one said this publicly, but I don't think they thought for a second they were going to find anyone alive. This was really about bringing closure and bringing comfort to the families by enabling the families to have the remains of their loved ones so they could bring them to their final resting place. And I'll tell you why. They shared with us the way this building went down in a very different way than most disasters they've been in. Most disasters that they go to, there's actually hope. This crunched like a pancake, meaning there was between 5 and at most 10 centimeters between each and every floor. It literally like that. That's how it came down. And that's, most buildings fall, most buildings tumble, and there is a chance, there's always going to be a couple of miraculous stories. The problem with this building is the way that it went down. So they were really there, and that's why it was the reservists as opposed to the active duty soldiers, because these were people who've dealt with families, dealt with survivors of having lost loved ones, etc. Yes, they were working day and night. They had 2 12-hour shifts, but it was as much about the comfort and consolation as it was their participation in the rescue effort.
Thank you. Marty Zukoff asks, what percentage of lone soldiers make Aliyah and remain in Israel? By the way, we have several from our community who are there as lone soldiers.
You know, that's an incredible question. And I'll tell you, I would have to ask Nefesh B'Nefesh. We fund all of the lone soldier support and financial aid, but the ones who administrate it are Nefesh B'Nefesh. A large percentage of them, sometimes it's they themselves and sometimes it's their parents, want them to get an American education. As a lone soldier, one of the things we provide, if they stay in Israel, they will have a free university education. We'll pay for it. We pay for most of it. The Ministry of Defense pays for a minority of it if they stay in Israel to go to university. But a large percentage of them will come back here for undergrad and graduate school. And I don't have those exact numbers. I would have to find that from Nefesh B'Nefesh.
Okay. David Margulies asks, how does the leadership of the IDF inculcate ethical principles in the minds of soldiers?
To be a commander, there are 3 different stages depending on what level of commander you are. The first is a place called Bahad Echad. One thing I've learned about the IDF, it's all acronyms. You know, when you hear a word, just assume it's not a Hebrew word. It is Hebrew. It's not Hebrew, it's not. And that's the way they work. And that's why, by the way, it's Americans, because they didn't grow up in these acronyms. So even if an American learns Hebrew language and goes to one of these training programs in the Hebrew language, doesn't mean you understand the lingo that's used. So what happens is Bahad Echad, which is in the Negev, that's the equivalent of West Point. Okay, that's one stage. There are 2 other stages where they get trained. They focus on educating and transforming the commanders in Jewish values and in ethical values and in moral values. And no matter how talented or how intellectually capable you are, if they have questions about your morality, your ethics, you'll never get anywhere in that system. That's number 1. Number 2 is every soldier, it's mandatory that the commanders take their soldiers for 6 to 7 days of Jewish and Israeli education. And I don't mean sitting in a classroom. They learn experientially. They might go through a day or 2 through Jerusalem and learn the history of Jerusalem and what Jerusalem means to the Jewish people. You know, they'll go to the Kotel tunnels. They may go for a day to Har Herzl, and they'll use Har Herzl not as a cemetery, but they'll use Har Herzl as a history book, a living, breathing history book. The same is one of the programs we fund is in the footsteps of the Maccabees. They won't only learn the battles, but they'll learn the context and the history of what the Greco-Syrians were doing to the Jews. So part of the experience in the army is an educational experience. And it's very different because in high school, you sit in a classroom, you have to take exams. Here, they're actually learning, living, breathing, and experiencing history. And that's another dimension of trying to inculcate a certain sense of values into these young men and young women.
You mentioned 1 or 2 of the projects that Friends of IDF subsidizes or pays for. What could you tell us a little bit more about Friends of IDF, how they were formed and what they do?
It was actually in 1980, 81, I apologize. It was a group of Holocaust survivors who just felt that they never wanted to see happen to the Jewish people again what happened to them. It were survivors who started it. And there were a couple of chapters, one in New York, one in Chicago, one in Miami, and it really started to grow and emerge into blossom. What we do is I sit with, first of all, the head of the IDF, Aviv Kochavi, who's an incredibly talented, humble, and great man. I sit with a man by the name of Amir Eshel. He used to be the head of the Israeli Air Force. He's the CEO of the Defense Ministry. Benny Gantz is the defense minister. Benny Gantz used to be the chief general, the chief of staff. He's the defense minister, but the one who runs the largest budget in Israel, which is the defense ministry, is Amir Eshel. So I sit with him, and then I sit with the general staff. And what they're looking to do is, because they can't afford to give the kind of educational enrichment, the educational tools to these young men and young women, what do? They're saying, this is what we like. This is what we think would enable them to build Israel for the next 60 years, not as soldiers, as civilians, to contribute and build the Jewish world, the Jewish society as civilians. And what we do is we provide during their army service and after their army service. Most of what we do is educational, literally from one extreme to the other, from the most challenged, like we've spoken about, to the most superior, to encourage them to stay another 2-3 years in an intelligence unit, as opposed to going to the dot-com world. We'll have those kind of programs. We also have incredible programs for the most financially challenged, the most vulnerable. I'll give you an example. We have food relief funding. They get vouchers that can only be used in the supermarket. We have direct deposits into their personal bank account and into their parents' bank account. It used to be, until COVID, 8,000 soldiers were from below the poverty level. So we funded them and their families. Unfortunately, after COVID, when Israel, who was doing exceedingly well economically, went from 3.8% unemployment to almost 25, the official number went up to was 21.75, but that's not a real number. That doesn't include self-employed Israelis. If you include all the self-employed Israelis who are out of work, 25% of the country was unemployed. So we ended up having 35,000 soldiers to fund just their basic welfare relief. And that's part of what we do. And then the other piece of what we do is, PTSD. If God forbid a soldier can't function as a human being because of what they've experienced, and I've met with a number of them, and one story is more horrific than the next. So we're also working with the Defense Ministry on funding therapies for those who suffer from PTSD.
Wow. Michelle Margulies asks, how can we get the rest of the world to hear this information? Are we only preaching to the choir?
We've brought in some people who, as volunteers, who really have a background in marketing, how to tell the story when someone only has, a 15-second attention span. We're trying to figure that out. Michelle, if I had the answer to that question, I would either be a magician or I'd be, the CEO of some firm on Madison Avenue. But it's very challenging because I can tell you, Michelle, the following. It's the first time, that I work hand in hand with what's called Dovrei Tzahal, the spokesperson's office at the IDF. I used to say, God, the Israelis, they can develop, they can create Iron Dome, they can create driverless automobiles, they can do anything. Why can't they figure out how to do Hasbara? Why can't they figure out how to? Well, I was wrong. I was totally critical and didn't know what I was talking about. Now I see, during this 11-day war, they took the foreign press corps everywhere. One simple example, the Erez crossing. Israel was sending in tens of millions of dollars a day of just basically food relief, health relief into Gaza. The Hamas rockets were targeting Erez. They were targeting the crossing to try to prevent and create a humanitarian crisis. Now, everyone was there. The BBC, Sky News, CNN, MSNBC. The only news station that even showed this was Fox. I'm not here to be a champion of Fox. Fox is the only one that reported this. Everyone, the New York Times, they were all there. The Washington Post, they were all there, and none of them wrote about it. So you can take the horse to water, but you can't make it drink.
Marty Sukoff asks, are you aware of a new organization called the Bayit Brigade? They help lone soldiers financially after discharge so they can remain in Israel. Can friends of IDF work with them to enable lone soldiers to remain in Israel?
First of all, I'd love you to send me a material on that. I will tell you this, we are spending right now, and it's a very tough raise, we're spending over $5 million a year just for lone soldiers. And we're responsible for any of them that go to university in Israel, we're responsible for their education. That's another couple $1 million a year. Not to mention that we're in the process of building a lone soldier home that's going to house about 196 lone soldiers in Rishon LeZion, Israel's fourth largest city. We're in the process of building a $17 million project. The shovels are actually going into the ground either this month or next month. So we're spending a lot of money on lone soldiers, and we really could use support, but I'd love to know about this organization.
Okay, so Marty, if you could send that to me, you can email that to me, and then I'll email it to Rabbi Weil. Josh Sachs asks, are there any legitimate criticisms of Israel or the IDF?
There are legitimate criticisms of anything in Israel. Whenever you have human beings are going to make mistakes. Sometimes human beings are going to do the wrong thing. And there are legitimate criticisms. I will tell you this, though, what's incredible about the IDF. Most of the time that someone does something wrong, they're called out on it. They're dismissed. Sometimes they're prosecuted when someone does something wrong, number one. Number two is there's an extremely high moral culture. And there's incredible disdain for anyone who violates that moral culture. I'm speaking on a commander level, those who are responsible for the soldiers. But yeah, you can criticize anyone and anything because as human beings, by definition, we all have flaws and faults. The problem is that when you look at the facts and when you compare this, I'll give you one simple example. I went with Brigadier General Benzi Gruber, child of two Hungarian Holocaust survivors of Auschwitz. His mother was her and her twin sister were the objects of Mengele's experiments. They never thought they'd have children because she never regained her period. And she's a woman over 40 and she became pregnant. And the baby she became pregnant with grew up to be a man who now is a brigadier general in the IDF. He speaks every year to the graduating cadets at West Point, and he speaks to the graduating cadets of the Air Force in Colorado Springs. And his topic is asymmetric warfare. And he shows videos, of operations that were aborted, operations that went through, in Gaza, to show them how they deal with asymmetric warfare. So I can tell you, this is not secondhand, I was there. They must have given him a 3.5-minute standing ovation, the cadets at West Point. I never saw anything like it. It was a massive auditorium, and they were so enamored and so impressed. But most of their questions to him were challenges. They said, we've trained here for 4 years, and there's a culture in the American armed services, especially for cadets who are going to be the leaders. There's an ethical, moral standard. You are so far beyond it. We think that you're putting your soldiers at risk. We think that you're putting Israeli lives at risk. They were challenging him. There's a phrase, al tahit tzaddik harbek. Don't be overly righteous. Don't be too righteous. And some of the criticism of Israel, in my opinion, is that they're overly righteous. They're too righteous because they put their own soldiers and their own civilians in harm's way. And unfortunately, again, you don't see that. You don't see that in the media.
Will the new government of Israel impact the IDF, or how will it impact the IDF?
If this government stands, the most important thing that Israel needs, and by the way, whether that government is like this government, which is a government that is representative of everyone from one extreme to the other, or whether it's a left-wing government, whether it's a right-wing government, whatever the government is, what's necessary and what has literally handicapped Israel since 2018 is the lack of a budget. If you don't have a budget, because Israel since 2018 has been going now, I think I'm correct when I said 2018, yeah, the end of 2018. It's basically been going on a month-to-month budget. The education ministry, the welfare ministry, the defense ministry, you can't run a country that way, that you're working off a month-to-month budget, because it means you can't sign a long-term contract. It means you can't sign a long-term anything. It means you can't invest. And what this country, the country of Israel, needs right now is a budget. Some won't like the budget, some will love the budget, some will be neutral about it, but it needs a budget that enables all of these institutions that we call the education, the welfare, the transportation ministry, the defense ministry, to be able to function under normal business protocols and normal business rules. So answering your question, I don't think the FIDF will be helped or hurt, whether it was a Netanyahu government, if he had a coalition that could form a government, or whether it would be, Yair Lapid and Naftali Bennett and their coalition. From the point of view of the IDF, I don't think it makes a difference. What makes a difference is that they can function like every other army, where they can invest in long-term planning and in long-term investment, which they haven't been able to do the last couple of years. It's a disaster.
Right. I think Israel does need a budget. Absolutely. Russ asks, do you have any suggestions for what to do with social media posts or articles that pursue a slanted narrative? How should we think about balancing calling more attention to the original post with trying to set the record straight? And these days, even if a response is drafted, does anyone listen to narratives they don't agree with?
You said it. I just, again, I'm not an expert in this. So anything I say has no validity. I have no weight or training in this, but my gut is that a good offense is the best defense. Instead of always responding to someone else, just go out and come out with a good offense and tell our story and tell it in an interesting, meaningful way, and make the points. We need today influencers. That's how social media spreads. That's how people read. People don't use their brain. They read 20 the words on a tweet. It's TikTok. It's a disaster. I'm talking about people with a high IQ. Their whole worldview is based upon TikTok. And you and I know that a picture's worth 1,000 words. A video's worth 4,000 words. So we have to use that media. By the way, right now we're redoing all the emails that we send. We're sending videos in our emails. Nobody wants to read text, so we're sending videos. And then if you want to read text, there'll be text below it. But it's a different world than I grew up in, and we have to use different tools.
You titled this talk, "The IDF, the Jewish People's Most Transformational Institution." So the question is, transformational, transforming from what to what?
I would say transforming from kids to adults, transforming from dysfunctional, challenged, to functional, to proud, to courageous, to engaging, to building. It's the transformation of lives. So in some cases, like we said, it's a maturity issue. You're taking a kid and turning them into an adult through this experience. But in other cases, you're taking someone who unfortunately was not given the tools that some of our children and grandchildren have been given. And you're giving them the tools to have a second chance. We say in Yiddish, to be a mensch, to believe in themselves. If you believe in yourself, you can believe in others. And a lot of people on this planet right now, they really don't believe in themselves. And that's the difference between Israel and America. A lot of the people don't believe in themselves, blame it on everyone else in America. It's always someone else's fault. In Israel, it's about personal empowerment. It's about having the opportunity to reach your potential. It's not about feeling sorry for yourself. It's about having the ability to make a difference and care for others. Because if you care for others, by definition, it breaks the narcissism that is so rampant in our children today. Why? This is the greatest tool for a narcissistic lifestyle. And it's just the way that we raise people in America today. It's a tragedy because America is the greatest country on earth and has provided our children and grandchildren historically the greatest blessings. But unfortunately, we've gone. I feel very sad to say this. Many of us in America, we've lost our path, and we've lost our values. And in Israel, it's not so. They're infused with Jewish values, a Jewish sense of giving, a Jewish sense of responsibility, a Jewish sense of commitment, a Jewish sense of passion, a Jewish sense of caring for the other, a Jewish sense of not, shaming and blaming, but taking personal responsibility. Those Jewish values that America so desperately needs today, that you and I took for granted when we were raised and when we grew up, they get that through this transformational institution called the IDF.
From where I sit, it seems to me in just a few days, we'll be sitting on low benches. We're going to be reading Echa, the Book of Lamentations. We're going to be mourning the destruction of both temples. It seems to me that the purpose of the IDF is that we never, ever have to do that again or mourn those who died in the Shoah. And that's the point of the IDF.
I want to thank everybody. I want to first of all thank Rabbi Bernhardt and Jewish Federation of Delaware for putting together this program. This is not a one-shot deal. Rabbi Bernhardt has been working on a series of really phenomenal speakers from across the spectrum, many different disciplines, and it takes a lot of work, and I want to thank Rabbi Bernhardt. But I really want to thank Rabbi Weil, and it's Rabbi Bernhardt's comment really brought to mind something. Rav Soloveitchik asks the question of why is it when we see Jerusalem as a thriving Jewish city united, why do we mourn on Tisha B'Av? And he gives several answers, but one of the answers is to remember that it can happen again, and that we all need to be very focused on that point. And there are many people and institutions who stand on the walls of Jerusalem to prevent that from happening. As an institution, the IDF is foremost in that. As an individual, Rabbi Weil is right there on the front lines with them and has been for his entire career. And we all need to be up there on the walls with them. So I want to just point out, and I'm going to embarrass Rabbi Weil a little bit here. Rabbi Weil has not asked for an honorarium for this, and did it because of his commitment to bring this message, to our community as well as many other communities. And I would ask everybody here to consider showing their appreciation by, first of all, just stepping up whatever we do, by internalizing this message, by telling people that this is the story of the IDF, not the stuff that we see on CNN or read in the New York Times, or is there a local paper in Delaware? We stopped our subscription many years ago. That is not the IDF. This is the IDF, and we need to tell people it's not up to the Israeli government or the Israeli military to do that. It is our job, and that's one thing that we can do. But I also want people to think about whether to show some support, concrete support for the American Friends of the IDF in honor of Rabbi Weil and the work that he's doing, and more than that, in honor of all those boys and girls, men and women who are serving with honor and distinction in the IDF. And thank you all for participating today.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Weil, and thank you to Wendy Berger and Seth Katzen for their help, the technical side, and Seth just posted on the chat, Toda Rabah, we grow stronger together, and that's amen to that. So Tzom Kal, an easy fast to you, Rabbi Weil, and thank you very, very much. Have a good day,
Thank you, Rabbi
everyone.
Bernhardt. Thank you very much.
Have a good day. This concludes our program.